Aware of the nuclear missiles aimed at one another, aware of the growing stockpiles of chemical, biological weapons, and really concerned about America, and absolutely impotent. No sense at all that I could have any hope of making an impact on anything. And went out hitchhiking around the world for 3 years. And in some sense, it wasn't the decision to do Earth Day, but the decision to go in the direction that Earth Day took. Happened one night in what is now Namibia. Lying at a crossroads, there was nobody picking me up that night, and I went up over a hill. It was one of those kinds of nights you only get in the desert. It probably had some of the elements that were there with Old Testament prophets. I was really hungry. I'd been hot all day. I was freezing at night, and something just popped, and in this well-illuminated sky, suddenly that ecology seminar came together with a great many of the problems that were afflicting people, and it occurred to me that the one species that wasn't abiding by these various principles of ecology, that was completely indifferent to pushing as hard as you can on energy efficiency, which is the governing rule of nature, that wasn't cherishing diversity, that wasn't understanding carrying capacity, that wasn't on and on and on, was us. And if those principles applied to monkeys and to orangutans and to chimpanzees and to gorillas, probably we could solve some fairly important problems if they applied to us. I'd read all of the great philosophers by that time that were trying to figure out ways that were different ways of organizing society, including the ones that were only fashionable in the 1960s. A large part of the trip was to see what I could learn from Frantz Fanon, from Herbert Marcuse, places in the world where some of their ideas were being tried. I found no particular answers there, but I got up the following morning deciding that what I wanted to do with my life was to get some sort of historic balance, some balance in some natural sense between us and our environment. So there was a senator from Wisconsin, Gaylord Nelson, wonderful guy, who had it in his mind that the anti-war movement in its early days had had teach-ins, and the civil rights movement in its early days had had teach-ins. And he was concerned mostly about conservation issues, the forests kinds of issues. And so he thought we'd have a big national environmental teach-in. I was a student at Harvard at the time. I needed to do something that was outside of the academic experience as a project in one of the courses. Nobody at Harvard had talked about this thing, so I figured I could probably organize Harvard. And with all the arrogance of youth, I flew down to Washington, D.C., arranged a 5-minute courtesy invitation with the senator, and aspired to see if I could, I guess really in my ambitious way, I thought maybe I could get the charter to organize Boston. It turns out nobody was really organizing anything. He'd given this speech on a few occasions. One of them was at Airlie House in Virginia. It was attended by a reporter from the New York Times named Gladwin Hill, a very senior reporter. He'd been there for 4 days in this fairly luxurious conference center. He had to write up something. The only thing that had happened was a speech by the senator, so he wrote that up. And on what was probably the slowest news day of the 20th century, it was on the front page of the New York Times. It sounded like it was happening. It's what I was reading that caused me to go down there. And it had gone out on the Times Syndicate, so suddenly Gaylord's office was flooded with mail. He was really quite concerned with what the next steps were. The 5-minute conversation turned into a 2-hour conversation. I went back with the charter to organize Massachusetts. 2 days later, got a call saying, "Would you come down and organize the United States?" And it was entirely compatible with what I wanted to do with my life. And then just a quick fillip at the end of this. Turned out that the idea wouldn't work because on college campuses, people were worried about the war. They were worried about women's issues. They were worried about civil rights. They'd never heard of ecology. But when you scanned through the mail that had come in, there was a huge number of letters from women in single wage earner families, typically college educated, typically 1 or 2 kids, typically a little bit of time on her hands, typically a little bit like some of the Encore Career people that are here, who picked it up and responded. And I'm guessing of the 20 million people who participated in that first Earth Day, we probably had no more than 3 or 4 dozen campus teach-ins. In fact, the greatest contribution I probably made to the whole thing was to change the name from National Environmental Teach-In to Earth Day, which first resonated very broadly with the American public and turns out also to be translatable into every language in the world.
So here we are now in 2008, and we're going to adjust. So would you start from the beginning again, please? Where were you in Namibia? Now here we are in 2008, and the next president of the United States is generally referred to as black. He calls himself a mutt. The Secretary of State is going to be a woman who might easily have been the candidate and the president of the United States, and she's replacing a black woman. The level at which there's anybody who doesn't know what ecology is. And the movement has found in Al Gore a kind of personality that, the rest, I think for history is going to say just what might have happened if Al Gore had been able to just get those little votes in Florida. We might have had a different decade.
Or even those little votes from the Supreme Court.
Or the votes from the Supreme Court. But what's so striking is that with all of these young people, and you represent them here today, being able to transform this country in these very distinct ways for the better. I guess the first question I would just ask you to address it relatively tightly, but do you think, Professor Carson, that the civil rights movement has reached its goals? Has it succeeded? I was so struck at the time of the first debate, which was at Ole Miss. I happened to stumble on the next day to Martin Luther King's speech, in which he said, "One day, roiling with hatred, he invoked what might happen in the state of Mississippi." And I heard that on the morning after the debate in which Barack Obama had done so well, not 50 feet from a statue of James Meredith. Do you think that those things that you did, you and Suzanne and Dennis, do you feel a sense of achievement, or do you feel that the goals are only partially met? And when we get through that, we're then going to see how we apply that arc to what we're all here to talk about. So why don't you see if you can.
Well, one of the unsuccessful campaigns I've done during my career as a historian is to try to question the term civil rights movement. I've always been very troubled by that because it gives the impression that what we were struggling for was civil rights legislation of the kind of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965, and certainly those were major victories. But if we had been basically a civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael and Bob Moses and so many of the other people who I greatly admired in the struggle would have retired. They would have said, we won. They would have been satisfied with those kinds of changes. And often that's the narrative that are passed down to our kids, and it gives them an unrealistic picture because it doesn't explain why, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, King was in Chicago in 1966, and he was in Memphis in 1968. It doesn't explain what he was struggling for. And if you try to encompass everything with that term, civil rights movement, it misses those broader goals, why we called it a freedom struggle. Why I don't know anyone who in August of 1965 said, my gosh, now we've got our citizenship rights, basically, let's go home. We've got a lot better things to do with our lives. But instead, if anything, the intensity of the struggle increased. So I think that when we tell the story correctly, which I tried to do, by the way, with Eyes on the Prize.